And I think for someone like me who is a Rav, right? I was a Rav of Orthodox communities for 20 years under the banner of the United Synagogue in London. But we're looking also for a progressive left-leaning space to be able to express ideas. It's not easy. And so I feel at home here. I feel like this is an opportunity for me. This is something positive to be able to, where I feel almost comfortable to be able to say stuff, which actually, to be honest, probably isn't that radical anyway. But in the world we live in, is becoming, anything moderate, thought through, a little pushy is considered like, oh, over the cavadon. And so that's probably part of what I will talk about anyway. But I just wanted to say that it's really good to be here, and I look forward to developing more connection. I want to talk about a problem, and then I want to talk about maybe 3 or 4 paradigms that will talk to that problem. And the problem is power. The problem is power. Where we are at the moment, and I heard Rabbi talk about that, obviously, we can't sadly not talk about politics, right? I think we're a religion at the moment. Generally, we live in a world where it is difficult and impossible to not talk about politics. I don't mean political parties, I mean just politics in terms of the relationships between people's nations. Look, the way I was brought up, I suppose, I'm 52 years old now, so there's a little bit of time I can go back to. And probably for many of us, the relationships that existed between nations, the multilateral structures of rules, the sense of individual autonomy and growing liberty is what was part of living in the West, I suppose, Europe and the United States. But what we're seeing now is the growth of power and self-interest. They're becoming more prevalent. They're becoming more prioritized. The idea of wielding power and pushing back on what is seen as self-defeating in liberalism is what we're seeing really growing at the moment. And so it's almost like we need to take sides. There's almost this clash, growing almost civilizational clash, not as Huntington talked about, but between a desire to hold on to democracy and liberalism, which, by the way, is almost a blip in history. We think of it as the normality of life. But there are many thinkers, I'm pretty sure Stuart Hall, when I read him, used to talk about it as almost an abnormality, right? German thinker Yasha Munk, brilliant guy, Jewish guy, talks about exactly the same. So we need to hold on to it. And migration, I work for HIAS UK, which is the British office of HIAS, basically, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, based in America, over 100 years old. And we help refugees and asylum seekers, and we push a really positive communal attitude of compassion and responsibility. And I say arvut, by the way, when I say responsibility, to refugee asylum seekers. But they've become a symbol for the populist right of a sort of civilizational failure, right? We're seeing now the mainstream of white replacement theory, a deeper racialization. We're seeing power being used on the streets to remove people, to make people feel frightened, to frighten other people. And these clearly seem like backward steps where there is a growth of power, which at the same time starts to emphasize hierarchies, often racial hierarchies, as I say, often split over racial differences, right? Migrants and refugees become the other, right? We put them outside of settlement. I know that's something in America. I know here we're starting to talk about military sites to house asylum seekers. And we're very, very concerned about that, right? Out of sight, they're in camps. They become a caste in a way that you don't see and you don't touch and you don't go near and you worry about and you're concerned about. And Israel obviously has to maneuver this growing reality. Where does Israel place itself in this rupture? That's the word that Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, used at Davos, right, a week or two ago, where he talked about rupture. Where does Israel side? Where does Israel go? Does Israel go on the side of power, right? And I'll put it as a question, and I think we all know, sadly, we know the answer and we know what we want it to be. Or does it go on the side of, okay, yes, one needs to defend oneself. It's not passivism, but on the side of values or of liberalism or of respect for the autonomy or building societies and a people. And so the path of Zionism in the 21st century has created deep and difficult dilemmas for us as left-leaning progressive people today. We are in a really difficult situation where Zionism is becoming synonymous with the yielding of power. Now, maybe it was always the case, but with power comes hierarchy. The Arabs of Israel, the Palestinians in occupied land, who are out of sight, by the way, generally are stateless. And actually, I was thinking that maybe one of the traumas of the 7th of October, Shiva October, among the countless traumas, was the breaching of the wall between those in Israel, especially Jews, and that Palestinian other. They came in, they penetrated, and creating a deep sense of vulnerability. This concept of caste is very interesting. And if you look at a book, I don't know if you read it, by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste, she talks there about the Holocaust, about black slavery and blacks in the United States over the last 100, 200 years. Incredible, incredible book about this concept of caste and people who you don't touch. You don't go in the same pool as them. You're not in the same space as them. I think of Mitzrayim and our experience that we're reading about in the Torah at the moment. Separation from society, separation from the folk, oppression if needed, no pathway for upward mobility within society. So do we need to accept that the protection of Zionism today can only be based on the suppression of the Palestinian other? Now, we need to protect ourselves. But is there an issue of power? And so, at a moment when racialized thinking is growing in the Western world, right, where white replacement theory, right, populist right, within MAGA, within Reform UK in this country, within Orban, AFD, the Austrian far right, this is precisely the moment when Jewish people, both in Israel, through politics there, and outside Israel as a reaction to anti-Semitism, are looking to use power to protect and ally with these parties. So can we create, or are we creating, a left-leaning religious critique of this wielding of power that stands up to this MAGA narrative, that stands up to the prioritizing of power? Can we push the diaspora Jewish leadership to see this problem and to push back against it and create a gap? And this is quite radical, but I think quite important, between the diaspora and Israel. Whereas the understanding of Ben Gurion was almost that the diaspora collapses into Israel, and there's a negative look on the diaspora as a reality for Jewish people historically. The reality does exist, the diaspora does exist, and actually, in many ways, needs to be a critique of Israel. And to do that, it needs to create clear water, rather than it being always constantly thinking about supporting every policy, to be able to critiquing where things are going out of love for the concept of Tzionut. So not to leave with no hope, here are one or two paradigms that I've brought in that I think are interesting to look at. I think I've got 3 or 4 here that talk about power. Rav Isaac Breuer was born 19th of September 1883 in Western Hungary. I think he was called the Tzioni, actually. He had this nickname. He was an Agudist, right? His mother was the daughter of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, the grandson of. He was a member of the Agudat Israel. He was in favor of settling Palestine, more like a religious Zionist in a way. He accepted there was a concept, possibility for national emancipation for Jewish people in Palestine. And he wrote an essay called Judaism and National Home. And in it, he lays out a theory of nationalism. And he separates between what he calls relative nationalism and absolute nationalism. And he believes that whereas absolute nationalism, which is almost nationalism for the sake of power, for its own sake, with no value set behind it, it's always constantly worried about survival and sustaining. He believes that cannot be sustained, paradoxically. Whereas relative nationalism, which is for the idea, he talks about Judaism, the sovereignty of God. Therefore, relative nationalism, which is for the sake of the idea, is higher morally, and he feels actually more likely to succeed in the long run. So let me see if I can quickly read a paragraph of, not a long paragraph from him, if I get the paragraph that I meant to, relative national, relative nationalism is distinguished from absolute nationalism neither quantitative nor qualitatively, but really and simply by its relation to the idea. Its will to life is a will to true life in the fullest and truest sense of that historical term. Its affinity to the national soil is a true historical affinity, such as always existed between a people and its soil. And its protest against violent and illegal deprivation of possession, lasting through centuries, is a truly historical protest, as true as ever hurled at any brutal conqueror. I think that's brilliant. And that's Breuer there with a theory of nationalism that is against the autocrat, against the authoritarian, against the what he calls the brutal conqueror. And actually, it's not a surprise because if you look at Samson Raphael Hirsch on Kitetse, Parashat Kitetse, that's Perek Chav Hei of Devarim, Pasuk, I think we're talking about Yud Zayin, right? Zachoret Asher Salach Amalek, right? When he talks about Amalek there, he says the last page of this war will not be closed until the sword of Amalek shatters against a mightier sword when the power of the sword collapses before the power of the word, before a force which will blossom out in the world, depending solely on faithful obedience to God's law of morality. So this is pacifism, but the idea of the destruction of Amalek is about destruction of war, of power, of the sword, of what it reaps, and the desire for power. So that's one paradigm which is really, really interesting to look at, the difference between relative and absolute nationalism. And Hirsch goes on to critique Zionism because it isn't enough connected to the real sovereignty that exists, which is not the sovereignty of the nation, but is the sovereignty of God. And so actually there is here an opening where the sovereignty of God isn't disempowering, but is in a very sort of social justice way, very empowering. That's one, and I'm hopefully I'm not. What I'm going to do is
you have about 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, you're very good with your time. That's brilliant. So now two more. Rav Chagall, Rav Shimon Gershon Rosenberg. Very, very important because he talks about how exile is a natural state. Right? Rather than it being about the negation of the diaspora, right? He looks at, and he brings the Maharal for this as well. He looks at exile, and he talks about moderate nationalism. That he believes there's a real importance that the nationalism that takes place in Eretz Israel has to learn from the humility and vulnerability of what exists outside Israel. And he writes amazingly, the Torah's objective in decreeing the memory of the Exodus is to establish a solidarity of the defeated, not the victors. Epic past triumphs are not meant to make us drunk with power. Rather, they are to instill in us the faith that it is God who gives you power. So again, an incredible, this is in his Faith Shattered and Restored. Rav Chagall was an incredible Rav, very sorely missed. He talks about a softer nationalism. Sorry, I don't have much more time, but a nationalism that needs to learn from the exile. And there's an incredible understanding within the Maharal that the Makom of the Jews is the whole world, not just Eretz Israel. Kol ha'olam hu makomo. A fascinating limud from. Give me 3 more minutes, Benjamin, if you can, and I will just finish with Rabbi Sachs. Actually, someone mentioned Rabbi Sachs. So Rabbi Sachs wrote quite a long time ago a book called The Dignity of Difference. Came out in 2002. It was censored because, and I've got a pre-censored version. I'm always very pleased at that. And the bit that was censored actually said this: God has, in the course of history, God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to Jews, Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims. It would declare that God is God of all humanity, but no single faith is or should be faith of all humanity. So he sets up this paradigm. Now look, we can do the whole thing about what really he meant, as opposed to what other Haredi Rabbanim said he meant. But certainly if we escape the discussion over religious truth, he's certainly doing the sort of equalization of humanity. These all lie together and sit together in the world. And so he then, as a base of that, starts talking about Judaism as a nation that fights power and the sword. We saw that with Rav Shagar, we saw that in Hirsch, we saw that with Rav Breuer. And also a paradigm that leads us to focus on the other, the stranger, not just the one that should be helped, but the one through which to see the divine, the rock of diversity, which is so important. So he molds together this sort of diversity he's creating with the sense of importance of the other and also the helping of the other, the stranger that we talk about in the Torah. So those are three, probably even stroke four rabbanim, really important to us in orthodoxy, who I think are clearly talking about Judaism as a critique on power, maybe not new for some, but I think we need to use these sources to think of, reframe a Zionism today that has a connection to Eretz Israel, that maintains sovereignty, but also is able to critique its use of power. I hope that was helpful.